And today we are going to discuss the project of the budget 2016, and this topic is always difficult, and every year it's a challenge. And budget project is like some sort of a Bible where everyone can find proofs of his ideas, and every time we hear that the budget is complicated and challenging, and this year these are internal and external problems, economic crisis, external aggression, and political crisis, and misunderstanding by the public what is going on, and where is the light at the end of the tunnel. So from our side here in our Center of Reforms, we start a cycle of discussions with a view to explain to the public what is going on, where will be some positive results, what are the directions, and I'm very glad that here in our studio we have representatives of key centers that can help us understand the key directions, the key ideas of this document. And I give the floor to Pavlo Kukhta, who is going to start our discussion. Thank you, Oksana. Maybe I will start with the key topics to what we should draw our attention to. And this document is important, and I explain what differs it from the previous budgets. It reduces the part of the public sector in the economy. That is one of the key reforms for Ukraine, because budget sphere we are at the 9th place in the world, and we are poor country. The state doesn't function properly, and this way of distribution of funds is ineffective, and it reduces the rate of economic growth. This budget solves its problem, and partly just moves in this direction. And due to our estimates, we consider that it gives us an idea of what it will be. It's the acceleration of the economic growth to 3% of GDP. And even this year, we don't know what will be GDP until the end of the year, because budget plans are estimated and not fulfilled completely, and there's a large spectrum. What will be the share of public funds in GDP, and if we consider the next year, so we hope that this amount will be reduced. So this budget will increase financial capabilities of local budget. This is a step to decentralization, and their share is about a 1.5% increase in overall GDP. And it is also a step towards decentralization. In this budget, quasi-fiscal expenditures disappear mainly, and also recapitalization of banks, the funds of different character that provided some challenge to our budgeting. This is reduced to 16 billion, and maybe they won't be spent. So this is also a positive trend, and there are some packages or reforms that accompany this budget. They aimed to increase effectiveness of this budget, and also, for example, legalization of gambling, And you know that this budget brings this sphere into a legal area, and maybe the most important of this reform is verification of those who get benefits, pensions, and this will help to eliminate corruption in the sphere of social service sphere, pension sphere. And this is about 1/3 or even half of our expenditures. This is a huge part of the budget, and we should eliminate corruption in the sphere and to increase effectiveness of the use of funds for social security and pensions. At that, and the last one, this budget reduces taxes, and one of the key problems, maybe it's not solved, but we approach this decisions, and we got this low burden is lifted somehow, and this is one of the key moments that business had concern about. And at the same time, it leads to the deficit, increase of deficit, and this leads to some challenges for our government, and we will discuss these topics during our meeting. And as to macroeconomics, macro level, share of the budget in GDP and budget deficit, share of all public sector in GDP, the realization of this budget will reduce to 42% until 49%, because we don't know what will be until the next year. So also there will be a key indicator, 3.7%, and this will allow us to continue to work in IMF programs, and also different funds will be financed through the state budget, and quasi-fiscal expenditures also reduced to 0.7% of GDP. That is a great reduction. And if we are speaking about the revenues of the budget, what is the challenge there? Import duty is cancelled because it distorts economic activities, and it increases the problems, and this is an emergency measure, and we are glad that it's gone. And they decreased the revenue from National Bank. It gives the opportunity for the National Bank to independently conduct monetary policy and target inflation, and we'll hope there won't be such a terrible problem with inflation. That was made by admission, and at the same time it reduces revenues of the budget and should be compensated somehow. And the government goes along the way of the to get more taxes, and in some way some rates are increased if we are speaking about the income of physical persons, and also the increase in and improvement of administration, and restoration of economic activities, and the increase from the tax on income, and there are some risks. the situation, economic situation may be worse than expected by the government. So maybe there will be less money and less taxes paid. So the government tries to increase taxes from enterprises and to use state enterprises as a source of income, a source of money for the country. At the same time, if there will be success and we get the money, we will have more quality structure of state revenues. There will be less role of emission of the central bank and the revenues that is provided by NBU to the state, and indirect taxes will be paid. It's good for developing countries because they are neutral and they are less discretional, and there are less problems with the administration. And if everything goes well, this redistribution of revenues can be interpreted as a reform in itself. And also the increase of deficit of pension fund, the need to finance from the budget, the need to finance it, and the government also reduced expenditures here, and they reduced expenditures in other categories that help to compensate the expenditures for pension fund. And this is mainly education, science, health, and also defense expenditures. But this does not correspond to the decision of Council of Security and Defense. So there should be a 3 to 2%. And the Council required 3% of GDP for defense. And if we are speaking about support of standards in these spheres of education, health, it requires some reforms that will increase effectiveness of the use of funds, and due to the increase in effectiveness, we could compensate to the reduction of expenses and even to get something if the effectiveness will be more than the reduction of the expenses. So some structural changes that are done, that they are directed to improve the situation and to compensate to the reduction in absolute figures. And taking into account that the part of the pensions that will be compensated by the state will increase 1/3 of expenditures, even more. 40% these are from 22 to 39% in 2016 if this budget will be completed. This budget has social orientation, and if we transfer pension fund into state funds, so if this is done, we receive a large share of pensions and social benefits in the budget. If we are speaking about reforms that are needed for the compensation of these expenditures for education and health, these are optimization of schools, closure of schools in some villages, and also reform of state order in higher educational institutions, and also optimization of medical institutions, the reforms that is conducted during the last 2 years. They will more effectively use the funds, and the expenditure for state debt is also reduced 0.3 1%, and the biggest economy is done through the reduction of expenses for some ministries, some divisions, etc. For example, Minister of Infrastructure will use only 700,000 hryvnias. And also they cancel the dotations for coal industry enterprises, money that were used improperly before. And if we are speaking about financing of state budget, the main source is internal and external borrowing. We get more than we pay, and if we are speaking about privatization, there are 17 billion hryvnias. This is never done, and if we are speaking about structural reforms that should strengthen this budget, make it more of quality, and these are legalization of gambling. State enterprise will provide more profit, 30% for unitary enterprises, 100% verification of social benefits, whether these pensioners get this pension, whether they correspond to criteria for getting this assistance, and also increase of funds for museums, theaters, and other institutions like this, and help them to help themselves, and also to provide the local budgets, provide catering for kindergartens and schools, and also some higher education institutions will be financed from the local budget, and only small money will go from the state budget. And there are some pluses and minuses, but due to this approach, technical education will be more appropriate to local conditions and areas. And of course, some institutions won't survive if local government won't finance it. And the reform in the sphere of science, national academy will be reformed, and also there will be an audit of scientific institution, and that brings us to more civilized form of governance in scientific sphere. And those enterprises and those bodies that are not appropriate for our conditions, they will be transformed. And also the state service law provides the possibility to provide more money for the salaries of officials, and it will help to increase salaries of the key officers and officials, and the funds will be provided for the salaries of public officials. And also there will be fiscal rules that restrict the possibility to increase expenditures of governmental bodies, and also they can have more 15% or 15% less than their budget, and also they cannot give their money as they want, as the deputies could do that before. This is restricted, and it will increase the quality of budgeting. and also state guarantees and state that these issues will be monitored, and for this will be the Cabinet of Ministers will be responsible. So to summarize it all, this draft budget is absolutely new. It is balanced and to reduce taxes, and there are some structural reforms that allow to increase the effectiveness of use of state funds and the budgeting process. And it's a budget of reforms. Previous budgets just replicated the previous budgets. This is a budget that we hope that with this budget will be adopted, and those things, positive things that are there, that they will stay. I would like to clarify two things. We are speaking about that there's a percentage of growth introduced there. What is the driver of this growth, except gambling, except verification of the usage of beneficiaries? What are the drivers? And the second question, in order to continue our discussion, maybe to Elena, this year's budget, in terms of the local budgets could get 28 million to local budgets. Whether there was some optimization of the use of these funds?
As concerned the growth of revenues and expenditures, comparing with the plans for this year, they are a little bit lower than this year's expenditures and revenues. Of course, there could be some problems because we are living in the country with volatile economy and in the situation of warfare. So maybe the shortfalls to the state budget would be higher than we expect, but this is normal. Not too ambitious plans to earn more proceeds than we expected. As concerned decentralization, maybe some researches have been conducted. I don't know them, but I can tell you that it is not so important how these means have been used. Maybe it was inefficiently. It mostly seems to be that it was inefficiently used because the personnel was not trained. But now they will be able to strengthen their capacity to use this money which they now get at the decentralized local level. The sense is to train them through the competition between local authorities, how to use this money which they previously hadn't have in their hands. I'm giving the floor to Olena. The question was about the economic growth. It is planned at 2% trend. It is close to the consensus forecast. Some forecasts are more optimistic, some are more conservative, but we can't expect high growth of economy. And despite of very deep fall, and our banking system could hardly be the driver of economic growth, but 2% growth rate, even if it is 1%, it would not influence the budget much. The GDP depends also on inflation rate. Talking about the nominal GDP, the actual rate of economic growth, we will have an adequate nominal growth in GDP by the next year end. This is the answer to your question. Yes, thank you, but I would like to understand the budget is a kind of formalizing of the social agreement. Could you tell me who is in priority in our country and who will help the country to remain in a good situation, in good standing? What sectors will be drivers, or let's say which sectors will help us to remain afloat? The task of the government is not to support individual sectors. We have already such experience when we supported just individual sectors such as metallurgy or coal industry. That is why we have volatile economy. So I am sure that in our country we should have equal conditions for all sectors. We are now not talking small business, because this is exception of the rule, which really should be a subject of support, but they should receive not subsidies but easier conditions of functioning. So talking about the efficiency of this budget, our taxes which we pay should be efficiently used, and Ukrainian economy with high level of corruption does not allow us to use fiscal incentives like it was in the other countries. Last year we held high percent of GDP as compared to today's level. Now fiscal incentives would not be well grounded. As concerns the budget deficit, I would like to accent the main figures that the budget deficit is planned to be decreased from 4.1% in this year to 1%. Why is this important? Not because the IMF demands that, but because we have too high expenditures for servicing the debt. The expenditures are higher than the deficit. This year we planned 5%. Next year we planned 4.4%, which we need for stable countries' debt. We need such an initial profit. If we take out all these interest payments, we should have a positive figure, not negative figure. Then we will not face any matters concerning default and restructuring of debts. As concerned the budget deficit, they have such a large portion. This is quasi-fiscal deficit. This is Naftogaz recapitalization, monetization of banks and the fund of deposit guaranteeing, and all this broad deficit was planned at the level of 10% of the GDP. It was a plan. We will see the fact, the actual figure at the year end. And next year it will be reduced from 200 million hryvnias to 100 million hryvnias. The other important thing is to form prerequisites for monetization. This means issuing money means inflation. This is a pressure on currency, and the level of monetization next year is planned at 16%. Only 16 billions of money will be issued, will be monetized. They will go to the fund of guaranteeing of deposit guarantees for those banks which define. So we had 40% monetization level in the year before. It was 90%. So how much money our government should issue will depend on many different factors, whether we will get 17 billion hryvnias of proceeds. The parliament is not ready to deblock privatization process. There were several attempts to pass the relevant legislation, but the parliament failed. The funding is not expensive, but the main reasons we need it because it is loan and cheap resource. But here there is also a negative factor because we replace the internal debt with the foreign debt, then our risks would be higher in future if there is any devaluation. But we do not have any other way out because our internal debt is very expensive and we have no other resources besides the national bank. So the pillars which are included into the budget to strengthen the independence of the national bank and so on, and the last factor is cost of servicing the debt is rather high now. It is about 7% now. This is the interest rate, average interest rate which we pay. So the foreign debt cost us as low as 1 through 3% interest rate. That's all. I would like to give the floor to Mariya Repko. Each of you has a certain budget segment to explain. I think that when we provide description of all segments, then our viewers can compile the whole picture. I have 2 slides. I've looked through the budget from the perspective of other countries' experience, what results other countries have achieved, and whether the approaches and principles they used are comparable with those being used now in Ukraine in this draft budget law. As concerns institutional component, it consists of fiscal guidelines for successful reforms in many countries, fiscal rules were used, the reduction of incentives to overspend, and demotivation of non-target use of funds. The second is fiscal decentralization. The revenues could be increased only if 15% of revenues got and so Ukraine here use the best practices of other countries. As concerned the fiscal decentralization, we can see it in this draft budget. This is more powers provided to local authorities, and the share of GDP falling on them will grow from 5 to 6%. Maybe decentralization of budgets could be even in larger scope. We can see that the preferences, granting of preferences also is transferred to the powers of local authorities. Why is this good? Because local bureaucrats may see it better what is priority, what is local priority. Other some food provision at schools to children, or some subsidies for pensioners, transportation, public transportation. This helps to increase quality of public services. In a village, a person may come to the local head of self-government, and this head of self-government would not then say that this is Kiev to be blamed for bad roads or for some other inconveniences. So this budget provided the possibility for expenditures decentralization. The third component, we don't see it, I don't see it. This is political consensus to be available, political will, and coordinated efforts of the cabinet of ministers, of parliamentarians, to make the budget oriented to the right things, to decrease in the share of public sector of government. We can see now the lack of consensus and some battles between the top administrators in the ministries, between their top managers, the ministers of education reforms and healthcare reforms. Ministers should do that, but the Ministry of Finance now is doing that. That is why there is no consensus. And there is also large-scale social dialogue, which is lacking. The tax code, the budget are being discussed now in the society, but no efficient dialogue takes place with the government. This is the component which is missing in the current budget and tax code process. As concern other countries, Canada, upon the budget reform, have managed to decrease the state expenditures from 52 to 41%. Upon reform, Finland managed to increase the state expenditures from 60.2 to 49.5%. The same concerns the Slovak Republic. All those reforms were based on similar approaches. I took a Canadian example. The main matter in Canada when they reformed their financial sector in 1994 through 2000, the year of 2000. What was the specific function of the government? The first test was whether this function is in the interests of society. Is it important for society, this function? The second function, is it the function of government? Yes or no? For example, a road vehicle is not the function of the government. The government can this governmental function be transferred to some NGO. It doesn't matter whether it is licensing on something else. If it could be passed to NGO, yes, it should be passed then. So it is excluded from the budget. And the last test, the last question, could it be transferred to local level? Yes, if it could be transferred to the local level, how it could be made more efficient? We look, and the last resort is we look into whether we shall have enough money for all other items which should also be paid from local budget. If we don't have enough money, then we goes back and we should look again what function is more in the interest of society. In Canada, ministers and deputy ministers were initiators, but it was not on the level of the Ministry of Finance going and begging and asking other ministries to decrease their expenditures while civil society is in Ukraine just looking, watching how this process is taking place. We hope that next year our country also will use this kind of approach and the unified approach to review of the government's functions. What Canada has achieved. This was the economic growth and efficient cutting of the expenditures and efficient governmental management. Their expenditures decreased by 10 points of GDP. The governmental budget became profitable after 28 years of deficit budget. The GDP grew by 20% during those years, and this governmental debt, the country's debt decreased to from 70 to 30% in GDP. This is a result of the situation in this country in global circumstances. Its cooperation with the USA, so there were a joint influence of joint influence of different factors. So we can wish that Ukraine also has such development situation. So I have one question. Both Pavel and Elena told that the budget would be a loan submitted along with the package of reforms, and how strong is the link between the budget and the package of reforms, and if this package is not adopted, so how strong is the link, and what would be the B plan if the reforms would have not been passed? I think that Ukrainian parliament can spoil any draft law, unfortunately, but if the verification reform is not adopted, or decentralization reform is not passed, or if the reform of higher institution is not implemented, of course the influence on the draft on the budget would take place, and redistribution would of the expenditures would take place, and the proceeds also would be influenced. And if they adopt at least a part of the tax code, at least the tax rates, and if the package of reforms is not adopted, of course the negative influence on the budget will take place. The questions, the Ministry of Finance in their news briefing today told that the next year the expenditures will have 43%. Maybe they thought that this means that we will have 10 points 10% reduction in the expenditures, in the governmental expenditures. So they say that the expenditure fall will be much higher than in in other countries. They are quasi-fiscal expenditures. They are problems with recapitalizing of banks, and thank God we will not pay money for banks recapitalizations in future. And also energy efficiency reform helped us to depart from so high budget deficit, and our governmental machinery and corruption are at high level in our country. This also helped to decrease the budget expenditures. In fact, different countries decrease their expenditures not during 8 or 10 years. Sometimes they it was enough for them 3 or 5 years to conduct reforms. When some corrupt schemes are cut off, this is for the budget, and if some social welfare benefits are cut, this is not so safe. When the algorithm is used, which I demonstrated today, then there would not be negative consequences. Another question. We have budget, we have figures, and we can use Excel software tool and look how this budget, which is based on the new tax code, have you used Excel for simulating the budget revenues if misuse tax code version is adopted? You know that there are too many speculations now about 100 or 150 billion spread gap between the revenues and the expenditures. Yes, the gap would be very high if Yujanina draft law is adopted. Then this budget can't be adopted. If the tax code authored by Yujanina is adopted, then we can't adopt the draft budget in this version. So some things from this tax code should be adopted, or maybe her version of the tax code in full, but some amendments then should be included both into the budget law and into the tax code. But the range is not very wide. Some shifts could be adopted, but major amendments to the tax code can't be adopted 2 weeks before the new year. Dear colleagues, do you have any more questions? Viktor Skacharsky, as concerned quasi-fiscal expenditures, you told that the problem has been solved. If we look into the draft budget law, 16 billions are included for reservation for issuing bonds for Naftogaz and bank recapitalization. These items remain in the budget, and to 100 billion hryvnias could will be increased through contribution of confiscated assets. This year there will be 1.4 billions were planned, but only 777 million have been collected under this item of budget. And the other question about fiscal decentralization. You told about resources which local budgets receive. You told that the money will be transferred to local level to be distributed there by local authorities. And 25% of the unified flat tax would be taken next year to the central level. And you know that the income tax proceeds also are taken to the central level. This means centralization, not decentralization. In the conditions when local authorities' revenues will be 40% higher, we can't say about the lack of fiscal decentralization or that they do not receive higher revenues. They definitely will get more money than they will pay proceeds in taxes on the local level. Of course, the Cabinet of Ministers every year puts some fiscal expenditures, and this year these quasi-fiscal items are not so high.
Yes, absolutely right. Every year it happens like this, and they envisage that this sums will be overspent. So the reason is known. We can't say how much do we need for the fund of deposit guarantees. And today, for example, the estimate is correct, and in 3 months the situation will be different, and to pay the money to the people. And I can't see great risks here. This year we underdone a recapitalization of banks. There was a sum of 36.6 billion, and 3.3 billion were given to one bank, so underfinancing. And as to the fund of guarantees, there's overspending of resources. So the main thing is to reduce these figures. For example, Naftogaz is planning to show a zero budget deficit, and this was a black hole starting from 2009, and starting from 2009. They took the money out of the state budget, and in 2014 the deficit was 5.5% of GDP, more than the deficit of the whole system of state government. So this was the main problem, and I hope next year it will be solved. Unfortunately, we don't have time, so you will be provided an opportunity to speak informally. Maybe speakers will allow us this, and I would like to thank you for the start of such an important discussion. I would like to announce that during our next meeting and discussions, we're going to speak about the financing of those spheres that are important for common people, such as health, education, and fighting corruption. And people should get clear understanding how this budget will change their life. I thank all the participants of our discussion, and I would like to say that today our work is over, so follow our announcements.